So welcome to our Dharma time here at Brighton Bush Hot Springs. This is April 2016. We'll let the bell go to silence and we'll do the same. As we sit in silence, bring your attention back to the mindfulness tool where we started on Thursday night, the experience of sound and the immense space in which sound is moving. To orient yourself, you may first listen to the light experiences of sound, that which is tangible but need not be named. And then you can notice sound as a reminder that there's this immensity in which life is unfolding, the big backdrop of silence from which sound emerges and to which it returns. And then direct your attention down into the experience you're having as your body breathes you, without having to modify breath, and with a special interest in the pauses, as a reminder that the backdrop of breathing is also this immensity. And then notice your direct experience of the ground beneath you, however you're making contact with that surface. Blanket, mat, chair, bolster, ankle, sitting bone. And to notice those sensations involved in your connection with the ground, we notice without having to name, critique, evaluate. As you connect to these sensations, notice the quality of your awareness, the quality of your mind. You might notice if the mind is dull or alert, slow or fast, heavy or light, localized or global. Stay with the sensations of the ground a few moments more. Now return your awareness to noticing the breath that is breathing you without any need to alter it. As you notice the breath, also notice the pauses, like the backdrop of inhale and exhale. And notice the quality of your awareness. Localized, global, narrow or wide, slow or fast. And then return your attention to listening to sound and the immensity in which sound is occurring. And notice also the quality of your awareness there. And with appreciation for the opportunity to use your attention in this manner, and bring your palms together in Anjali Mudra. And you may bow your head to your heart. And release your hands. Open your eyes. So I would be curious to know from you, when I ask, notice the quality of your awareness, how it differs from sound and silence to the breath, to the concrete experience of the ground, and back. What did you notice? Can't get it wrong, by the way. It's not a pop quiz.
When you say that, I'm like a little bit more aware of what's going on around me, besides just me.
Mm-hmm. You become aware of the collective. Yeah. Nice.
I find it's impossible not to control my breathing once I start paying attention to it. Like it was going along just fine without me.
And then once you're aware of it, you start modifying it or kind of messing with it a little bit. Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
I found the sound the easiest one to not get distracted from. Because there's always, especially here because of the river, you can, if everything else is silent, you can hear the river.
Yeah. Sound is also the least personal of those three mindfulness tools. Right? The breath is relatively personal, very intimate, and your connection in the sensory body to the ground beneath you is also very personal. You are directly having that experience. Your neighbor may also be, but with sound you might be hearing the same immensity. And you're feeling the same ground, but having directly personal experiences about it. Yeah. What else do you notice? Yeah, Rachel, excuse me.
I have the opposite with the sound. I feel like nothing else is in the room except for me and the sounds that I'm hearing. And with the feeling, the grounding one feels more grounding. Feeling your body touching whatever it's touching. But I also seem to have these, it's like almost like I'm almost having an out-of-body experience when I start doing that. Like everything, like it feels like my hands are 19 miles away and I'm this really, 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 really long thing. I don't really know how to describe it. And I'm just sitting there and I can feel all the parts and I'm very aware of all the parts, but I am like way over there.
Yeah, well that's very cool that you have that experience. When I was a younger student of meditation, I often had the experience of feeling like I had disappeared and only the eyeballs remained. They weren't looking out at anything, I was just sitting in meditation, but I felt like this disappeared, and that was a lovely experience. I quite enjoyed it. I don't hear anything really disturbing about your experience. I think researching and being with it is fine. Yeah. The reason I was asking is because I want to speak tonight about the model of the Koshas, which I know is familiar to some and new to others. But the experience of where we place our attention, there is actually a roadmap, and that roadmap can be described as the Koshas. So when you're listening to sound, that's happening at the level of what's called the Manamaya Kosha. I'll describe the roadmap in a few moments. But the Manamaya Kosha is considered much more subtle than the Annamaya Kosha, the dense physical body. So listening to sound and that immensity in which sound is occurring, that's a more subtle skill requiring more diffuse and expansive awareness than listening to sensation directly in the body. where it's more dense. Like this thing right here that I'm touching and holding and moving about, this vessel through which I'm talking, is more dense, just by its sheer matter, than sound is. And certainly more dense than the immensity in which sound is moving. So in the Koshas, we're looking at the way the human being comes into form and what our ecosystem is in this one roadmap. And that ecosystem from the outside, looking in, which is a Western view and not the classical view. I'll give you that other direction in a few moments. But from the outside looking in, we have this dense physical body that we identify with. These are my hands and my feet. These are my eyes and my ears. And for a time when we start having the capacity to identify with this thing, that's very healthy. We need to have a sense that this is the body and the vessel that we're to care for. We don't have this immediately. When we are born, we don't have a sense that these are my fingers and toes. We're just in the awe of fingers and toes, and we start drooling over those. And the world is not separate from us, and there isn't a sense of self-other distinction. So it's all kind of one. For years, and I don't know if this is still happening in the consciousness community, but when I was in graduate school 27 years ago, there was this kind of ongoing conversation, is enlightenment just going back to infancy? Because when you were born as an infant, you experienced everything as oneness. The answer has sort of emerged now that the answer is no. Enlightenment is not just going back to infancy. You won't just be a drooling, helpless, vulnerable creature needing other people to tend to all of your needs. Enlightenment is the experience of that oneness, that sense of the unity and vastness and the preciousness. But it's after having experienced a sense of self, like this, that we have to care for. And my path as a yogi is mostly a karma yogi, so that means a householder yogi who has a desire to serve. So I need this vessel to be healthy enough to do that kind of service. And I need to care for it in proper ways so that service can come through me in a sustainable manner. But to be able to serve as a karma yogi, which means selfless service, there actually has to be enough sense of self in here to care about the organism. And that sense of self is associated with a certain part of your brain called the precuneus. Precuneus, the precuneus. And this brain system is coming on board developmentally right around the time that your third chakra is coming on board too. And that starts emerging before it's like bigger than we might think of it as. It's like you become 2 or 3 or 4 years old, little hints of the third chakra coming in. You start having a sense of my toys. Not your sister's toys. They are your toys. You start having a sense of your body and the foods that you may want to eat or not want to eat. But really a sense of self isn't just the demands you might make on other people about what food you want or don't want. This is how it starts, like, those are your fingers. That's your cup. This is your food, and so on. But as it keeps developing, the sense of self, we want it to be holistic. So holding that for a moment, the Annamaya Kosha then, instead of being just this dense physical body that is sometimes a burden when it doesn't feel well, and sometimes elating when it's having a joyful experience, rather than it just being something I'm supposed to have sort of control over, like here in the West, we should control our appetites. And by the way, you should control your sexuality too, and all of your other senses. Rather than it being something to dominate, we start feeling this thing called the Annamaya Kosha as that vessel through which we get to experience yoga and love and service and intimacy and community. And you do experience it vibrantly in this entire ecosystem here. In classical yoga, the physical body was something to be transcended. They practiced austerities so that they could overcome the burden of the physical body and experience consciousness, because they had an understanding that the matter, this is matter, and consciousness were separate. This isn't the lens that I look through, but it's important to note that historically, classical yoga was a dualistic path. There was the body, and then there was the spirit. And we were going to transcend this thing to experience that thing. You would say the way that I'm studying yoga and the way that I'm teaching yoga, if you had to put it in a category, it would be a combination of karma yoga, bhakti yoga, and tantric yoga. Tantric yoga is not the yoga of sex, by the way. I certainly enjoy sex, but it's gotten misunderstood here in the West. Tantric yoga is the yoga of using the entire ecosystem and all the senses to awaken to what is precious and to grace and love embodied. So sexuality may be a part of that, but you may also practice tantric yoga and be celibate. The senses are very alive, and there's a whole phenomenon to interact with in the world. So then this thing becomes something that we want to care for, and we turn to the path of Ayurveda to find out how do we care for the body. It has 3 seasons in life. The first part of our life in the body is called kapha, where we're building the density of muscles and bones and organs and the fluids of the body. So the earth and water elements are growing, and therefore we're developing, and we grow from the, this is how my husband likes to say, we grow from being born 18 years prematurely. Because as he says, of course, at this moment, in this kind of discussion with our students, he says, the woman could not give birth to the actual developed human being. It would not fit through the opening. So you're born as this little blob, and you get to develop structure, right? We want healthy bones and healthy muscles, and that's the kapha season of your life. You're also having your endocrine system come on board. So kapha, first 2 chakras, is really about the aliveness in the body and play and creativity and the sensuality of the world. Like flavors, sights, sounds, all 5 senses, and the 6th sense, which I call the 6th sense, is interoception. Means you feel things on the inside too. Like you have a sense of when you're hungry or when you're satiated, but you also have a sense of when you need to move and express joy, and when you need rest and inwardness. So this gives us the chance to explore all of that. And my hopeful outcome for us, even as grown-ups now, because we're not all grown-ups in the room, some of us are fortunate not yet to be adults, my hope is that we grow into these decades that we're in now without losing that sense of aliveness, playfulness, and the elasticity of the early life. Right? That elasticity, like if you look at small children, how elastic they are in their movements and their creativity and their spontaneity, and leaving that game to go to that game, and having that kind of fluidness. That's the water element that I want us to keep in our system, to keep it alive. Then this physical body goes to the next stage of life, which is called pitta. And pitta is the fire stage of life, fire and water combined. And those 2 elements combined create steam. If fire heats the tea kettle, it makes steam. So pitta is the most transformational season of our lives in consciousness. In terms of transforming unhelpful thinking or old habit, or transforming what was known into the courage to know what is not known, that's happening in the fiery part of our lives. So in early life, we're looking for stability and fluidity and getting a sense of who we are. But we come into the pitta season and we want to transform, to understand, to seek knowledge and insight and to put it into action. And we need fire to do that. Like fire transforms the water into steam, it transforms wood into light and warmth. It transforms one thing to the next thing. So the fire phase of our lives here in the West, rather than being about transformation, has become about consumerism. Fire does consume things, like it helps us consume food, but our culture has made fire season for consumerism. So including what your resume is and what your job status is and how you pursue, like increasing that knowledge or moving up in the company or gathering more money or more possessions. Our culture is relatively focused on that. I'm not saying that you are as individuals, but we live in a culture that has a strong pitta element to it. So the body starts to experience symptoms, because if the pitta is out of balance and we're pushing pitta to do this thing, the symptomology starts to show up as things like heartburn, anxiety, frustration, disappointment, despair, depression, and so on. We don't digest our life events very well. We're not metabolizing a painful event and churning it into insight. So that's when Pitta is out of balance. And then this dense body, the Annamaya Kosha, goes to the third stage of life, which is called Vata. And that's the stage of life where we have air and ether combined. That's after menopause, by the way. If you want to know, like on the body clock, when does that happen? It's when the fire is kind of burning out, and menopause for women, and about the same equivalent for men. And if we have a transformational investment in the fire part of our lives, we arrive in the Vata phase as the best expression of Vata, which is we're lucid, we're lighthearted, we have insight, we feel relaxed and like a little hummingbird enjoying the sunshine. People feel drawn to our lightheartedness, and there's a quality of wisdom in that lightheartedness. Our seniors in our world here in America don't look like that right now. Mostly they haven't been very well taken care of. And we don't have a culture that's promoting that at this time. But in Ayurveda, which was developed thousands of years ago, there was a lot of resource given to the Kapha phase of life for children, and tremendous support given to the Vata phase for elders. And the middle part just figured itself out. They were householders. They did the chores of what had to be done to care for the children and to care for the seniors. Does it sound like America? So that's when Ayurveda was created. And it's through the lens of the Upanishads and Ayurveda that we understand the koshas as a model to transforming our health, to respecting these different layers in the body. So here we have this outermost thing called the Annamaya Kosha, and it's written up over here on the board. Anna actually means food. So the Annamaya Kosha in this is anything that is sustained by food and also that becomes food. I love to remind people that you're on the food chain. And also that this thing is temporary. This little vessel you have is very temporary. So the Annamaya Kosha needs resource to support it in the form of food and proper movement, but it's also the least likely to change. Of these things called the koshas, our lasting changes are not made at the level of the body. You can change your hamstrings in yoga class, and that's great, but it's not likely to transform your samskaras unless you're attending to the deeper layers of your ecosystem. Like changing your hamstring length may not make you a happier person long term. Maybe short term, you feel some accomplishment. And that gain has its place, but it's ephemeral. Practicing physical asana to care for the body, to care for the next layer in, is called the pranamaya kosha. The pranamaya kosha is like all the electrical wiring that keeps Brightonbush going, as well as all the plumbing that you can't see under the ground. When you're here in the winter, sometimes you can see the snow is melting on the paths because there's a hot pipe going under there to carry hot water out to the cabins from the hot springs. So all that we can't see, but that makes the lights come on and makes the heat in the radiators and fills up those hot tubs in the morning and keeps the sauna bubbling along, that's the pranamaya kosha of Brightonbush Hot Springs. This building is like the Annamaya Kosha, having the blinds, the walls, the floors. This is the dense structure. So in our system, it's the nerves, it's the circulatory system, it's respiration. It's all that indwelling stuff that makes us come alive. Prana means vitality. So it's your vital body. Without which, the Annamaya Kosha is not that useful. In fact, it's not useful at all. I just had the tender-hearted human experience of giving my cat back to the earth. It was 1 week ago tomorrow. I'm sure some of you have been through this, so you understand, but when you're holding the cat and she's still purring, she was very sick at this point. Tristan had seen her at the office, so her name was Sherlock, and she was coming to the yoga studio with me because she had to be medicated every 8 to 10 hours. She had a sublingual tumor on her tongue, so she couldn't eat properly, and she was losing weight rapidly, but she was still purring and still exploring, and she'd jump off the office desk just like a kitten and wander around the studio looking at things, and she let us hold her and still cuddle her, and she purred constantly on the side of my neck. But then you could see it wasn't, we knew it wasn't going to get better, but you see it wasn't going to be much more time. So you start looking at her preciousness differently. And then when you're holding the cat and still purring and the vet comes, my good friend came to give the special injection. It's so quick. You know, they put it in, and then the purring left. But she didn't quite leave. You know, the feeling of Sherlock was still Sherlock, and I held her for a long time. She was wrapped in a towel because the tumor had started having some blood, so we were trying to keep it from getting all over us and other people. It was just a slow trickle, but it was still, she was in this towel, and she was no longer in there, but she was still with me. And after holding her for such a long time, when I picked her up to put her in her new home, which Jay had built the hole for, she was so limp. And I had forgotten that she would be that limp, because this has been years since I had the chance to do this. And my dog, who I had to put down, was too big for me to pick her up. This was years ago, so I didn't feel her limpness. So I picked up Sherlock, and she was definitely gone by then. She wasn't no longer in there, and her Anamaya Kosha was so relaxed. And I could see the Pranamaya Kosha didn't exist anymore, so the Anamaya Kosha was meant to become food for our garden. And her little Manamaya Kosha, which would be her senses and her personality, had also dissolved. It was gone. So some of you have had this experience, I can see. Yeah. Well, this is also our life unfolding. So to hypervalue the physical body may be a misunderstanding. And to see the pranamaya kosha that makes us come alive, and to value that for its infusion. This is where the koshas tell us to direct our attention. So that's why we have the practices of pranayama in yoga. To learn how to have this intimacy. You were saying it's so hard not to modify your breathing. But to come to it with that much respect, like I'm holding Sherlock, and I know this is going to be 20 seconds, and it'll be over. Seems like such a little blip after 15 and a half years. Sorry, Michelle. Michelle also met my cat at the studio, and I think Claudia met her as well. And I was holding her in my lap when I was talking with Seth the first weekend of our training. So, yeah, so fast like that. So to feel that love and preciousness that's happening there, that comes to us through the Manamaya Kosha. That's where we, as human beings, we have a sense of self, and we care. Sherlock's brother's name is Pilaf, and he's still as robust and plump a cat as she once was. And he sat right next to me while she was leaving. He had no story about her departure. He feels something is different, but I was a lot more sad than he seemed.
He was probably more concerned about you.
He was concerned about me, and so was Pukito. My little dog was sitting there too, and Jay and Jason were there, and Ashley was there, and Naya was there. So it was purposeful. But we have this thing then called the Manamaya Kosha, where our mind and our senses, we can tell that things are temporary and precious, and we care. And that caring makes us feel things very deeply. That's deeper than your hamstrings, much deeper than your shoulder blades. And that feeling body is actually deeper than your breathing. Your breathing has changed by my story, because you feel my experience and you feel some of your own experience. So that feeling realm also connects us. Our brains then light up this thing called the insula, which is where we experience empathy and interconnectedness. You say, wow. If you didn't have a precuneus, if that part of your brain didn't get to develop a sense of self here at the third chakra, you might care less about the experience of my cat or any other loss or feeling state. There has to be a sense of self in there enough to care, to feel. And some of us, not likely in this room, but some of the students I work with in the prison system, they didn't get to have their precuneus develop. Their environments were too traumatic or too neglectful or too shaming or too abusive, and their precuneus was pruned back instead of developing so the brain could grow a bigger amygdala, a bigger smoke detector, a bigger fire watcher. So they developed a brain that couldn't feel in the same way that ours feel. Too small a precuneus and or no activity really there in the MRIs, and not a lot of activity in the insula for empathy. Like that can also be pruned back. So that you're here means that you survived it enough, whatever it was. And I survived mine enough, and I can say more about it some other time. But we survived it enough that we can ask questions and we can feel and explore and research and try to put insight into action. So when we get the sense of self at the third chakra, it's through the fourth chakra we start having those feelings that we're sharing right now in your tenderness for my tenderness. And the Manamaya Kosha is responsible for the mind and the senses, but its vulnerability happens because it's so subtle. Sometimes the subtlety of the Manamaya Kosha for a small child is forgotten by the parent. And they don't realize how impactful their words or their voice prosody, their voice tone, or their own fear or anxiety are to the small child. And as young beings, we learn that things are the way they are, and it can stay for a long time in our worldview. So something that's lived in my Manamaya Kosha for a long time, which is, there's a couple funny things I'll tell you, they're just cute little stories. I was convinced that the porches on the second floor of the homes in Binghamton, New York, that had these slits, they were wooden fences, like on the front of the porch, and then there was a long slit, 2 or 3 of them. I thought those were for your toes. I thought you sat on the porch and you put your toes in the slits. Of course. It was for the rain. And for sweeping the debris off the porch. I was convinced this was for toes, and that families sat on porches and put their toes in those slits. My family didn't have a porch. We didn't have family time really to speak of. But we went to Binghamton to see my grandfather, who was, I'll tell the next story in a moment, and he was a very special person in my life, and I thought for sure that's how families got together. They put their toes in the slits and they hung out. I must have been 5 years old, and I thought this for a long time. Like, the realization, I was like maybe 15 years old when I thought, that's for rain. Because I was so convinced of it at this early age, it stuck around. Just like if somebody at an early age gets the belief there's something wrong with them, it can stick around for a long time. I mean, decades, 6, 7, 8 decades of believing there's something wrong with you. It's the vulnerability of the brain at such a young age that lets the Manamaya Kosha believe something it internalizes and then tries to organize around that. Another thing I thought was quite certain in my world, and I've told you this story before, some of you know it. My grandfather was extremely special to me in my life. He was my step-grandfather, though I wasn't informed of this. I thought he was my real grandfather, and to me he was. But when I was 8 years old, after playing teddy bear races for years, we used to chase teddy bears around the dining room table in a circle. He was the only adult who played with me. So it was really important that he was willing to chase my teddy bear with his teddy bear around the dining room table. And he also let me drive on his lap in the car without a seatbelt. And he showed showed me how to walk across a fence railing. Like, the fences poke up like that, but there was a little spot where your small feet could walk, and he was holding my hands, and I just felt like I meant the world to him, and so did my sister. She's my twin. So he was a big person for us in our worldview, and he died really suddenly when I was 8. And I didn't know what death was, and I didn't really know what it meant that he was gone. I could not conceive of this. At 8 years old, it's hard to really grasp that. So we went to see my grandparents and my relatives, and they kept saying, it's just that God took him early because he was such a good man. He was such a good human being, so God took him early. He was about 50 years old. Mm. And he was walking to work when he had a heart attack and died on the sidewalk. Like, there must not have been other pedestrians, or it was too massive a heart attack. So I heard these things over and over again in the course of hours at this funeral reception. And I was sure that my grandfather had to go to heaven to take God's job. I was so grateful that God wanted my grandfather to be God next. Like, I thought people rotated. We weren't raised with religion, so I didn't have a concept of God to be displaced. I just thought, my grandfather is now God. I was so glad. I could talk to him anywhere. I didn't just need him to be at home in his house where I visited him. So, of course, I outgrew that as my brain became an adolescent brain and I had more knowledge about the way the world works and I understood death. But what I'm pointing to is that you have an experience in early life, and your manamaya kosha, that thing that wraps your mind into form, believes things and can hold those beliefs for a very long time. Like a belief you might grow up with, nobody cares, nobody understands me. People should care about my feelings. People should be more respectful to each other. No one will ever get me. I'll never be good enough. It will never be good enough. Other people will never be good enough. They'll never meet my needs. I can't meet their needs. The way that these phrases, I'm giving you like a little buffet of them from my own life and my clients and students. But the phrases have words like never or always. They're like imperatives. They have a kind of finality or a statement. That's also because the brain is not that complex when we learn these things. And they become like bumper stickers in the mind. We're driving around with those statements, and other people might see them in us, but we don't know how obvious it may be, because it just feels like blinking. It feels as familiar as your own fingernails. This is just how you think. This is how the world is. And yet the manamaya kosha, because it's like a compilation of what you've internalized, and as well your sensory environment and how you've responded to it, it can't be ongoingly true. This is a purposeful and long pause. It cannot be ongoingly true. Because it internalized at too young a part of your life, and it wrapped a sensory event around that. It got encapsulated. But that can't be ongoingly true. You are still evolving every day. Every time you have a mindful moment or a yoga practice, or you have a good cry, you're evolving. When you feel love and expansiveness, you're evolving. But those little encapsulated things, they can hang around. Like when you have a myofascial spot in your body and you think, why isn't that getting better yet? That little knot of tension. This is like a knot of mental tension. And those most encapsulated things we call implicit memory. It means you don't realize that it's there. It's kind of implied about who you are. It hasn't yet been made different because the explicit opportunity to do so may not have arrived in your life yet. Blessedly, you found the path of yoga, which explicitly says we can heal and transform these things. Do you understand what I mean by this? Yes.
So that doesn't go back to the first chakra, not being firmly rooted or having a sense of tribe?
Yes, it does go back to that. So each of these potentially encapsulated and painful beliefs about ourselves. Or they might not be painful beliefs, they might be a belief that limits our life, like other people can't meet my needs and that's okay by me. Does that sound like a good way to live? Not particularly. So these encapsulated beliefs actually sit at each layer of the chakras. They can sit anywhere along that spectrum. And they are housed in the Manomaya Kosha. And then that flows outwards into your Pranamaya Kosha. So that when you get triggered and one of your personal encapsulations goes haywire, you don't just feel that in your mind and your emotions, you also feel it in your breathing, in your nervous system, in your skin, in your eyes, in your tongue, in your body. You feel it everywhere. And the flush that comes through you right there is an opportunity for healing. Or it's an opportunity to relive the encapsulated belief and make it deeper. To try to make it more true or to justify it because at the time you developed it, it seemed true enough. Yoga would recommend you use that flush for healing, to take that opportunity. So if you can have a hunch about is it a first chakra or second chakra or third chakra trigger, you have a hunch about where to do some of your work with that trigger. Do you understand what I mean by that?
Yes.
No.
And so let's say, I'm glad you're saying, let's say that when you get triggered, one of your encapsulated storms is you feel a kind of rage and fury that you want to push out on the world, to push it away. This painful thing, I just want to push it away. I want people to go away. In fact, maybe sometimes as kids we said bad things like, I hope you die. But we don't even know what that means. If it's that kind of fury pushing out on the world, you're probably somewhere between the second and the third chakra, where you have fire that's very intense, but you have a youthful sense of your agency. It's not quite developed there. And it's like when a temper tantrum with fire. So you're somewhere in here where the senses and the fire are getting mixed together. But let's say you have heartbreak, somebody leaves you, and you feel profoundly saddened and abandoned, and you collapse, and you're a watery mess of feeling pathetic, and you don't know where home is, and nobody will ever love you again. You're probably down here at the second and first chakra. And if that destabilizes your life enough, you start being unable to pay your bills or remember how to do your job and so on, you're probably at the first chakra. So you've unstabilized your life there. These are for big triggers I'm talking about, but you can see it in little triggers too. Is this helping some to put context on it?
So then where?
Well, I'm not done with the talk yet. I hope to get to that. Rachel?
Yes, before we get to go to bed tonight,
Yeah.
please.
Rachel?
So you can identify these different things in different chakras. Are you saying that your Manomaya Kosha lives in all these chakras?
Yes. Yeah, so the koshas, let me say this and then I'll finish the kosha model. The koshas are over here in a little centrifugal circle model, like ripples on the surface of the water. Take that model, if you could, and make it like a frisbee, like this. It's round, I'm holding it in my hands. And put it at each of the chakras. Right? So every chakra has all the koshas. Yes, which is a totally cool thing. I wish I could make a hologram for you right here and now. I would love that. Tristan's on it.
I knew you were going to say that.
I need a giant slinky, a rainbow-colored slinky that's big enough for me to stand
Add
in.
it to my list.
The chakras are rainbow-colored. It's red, orange, yellow, like this. So if we had the human-size rainbow slinky, we